John Portuguese Phillips rode through 4 days of blizzards, temperatures plunging to -25 degrees. His mission deliver news of America's worst military disaster. When he staggered into Fort Laramie's Christmas ball, he could barely speak. His journey, 236 miles through enemy territory and winter storms, would save the survivors of Fort Phil Kearny. But it couldn't change the shocking truth Red Cloud had achieved what no Native American leader ever would again. He had defeated the United States military and would soon force them to sign a peace treaty on his terms. Portuguese Phillips's desperate Christmas ride had been set in motion by events that unfolded 4 days earlier on December 21, 1866. At Fort Phil Kearny, Colonel Henry B. Carrington monitored the distant ridgeline through field glasses. The sound of gunfire had ceased, and the rescue column he had dispatched under Captain William J. Ten Eyck remained visible on the horizon. The afternoon was advancing, and still no word had returned from Fetterman's command. Ten Eyck and his infantrymen had set out toward the battlefield after Carrington received reports of heavy gunfire beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. Instead of taking the direct route to the sound of battle, Ten Eyck led his men up a hill approximately 200 yards to the east. This longer path cost valuable time, a decision Carrington would later note in his official reports with clear disapproval. When Ten Eyck's rescue party finally reached the battlefield around Lodge Trail Ridge and High Backbone at about 12:45 in the afternoon, they halted at the summit. Before them stretched Piney Creek Valley, revealing a scene unprecedented in frontier warfare. An estimated 2,000 warriors moved through the valley floor. Some gathered arrows from the frozen ground for future use. Others lifted dead comrades onto crude stretchers fashioned from blankets and lodge poles. In the distance, another group gathered around a pile of rocks. No American soldiers stood among them. The warriors spotted the rescue party immediately. They raised their weapons, shouting and gesturing for the soldiers to descend and fight. Ten Eyck signaled his men to hold position. The column remained stationary, watching as the warriors gradually withdrew from the valley. Within minutes, the last of them disappeared over the opposite ridgeline. Only then did Ten Eyck order the advance. As the soldiers descended toward Piney Creek, they encountered the first signs of battle. Paper scraps drifting in the winter wind, letters from home pages torn from pocket diaries, fragments of military maps. The snow-covered ground transitioned from white to crimson. Horse carcasses, both American and native, lay scattered across the battlefield in the bitter cold. Ten Eyck's men spread out through the high grass and brush clusters. What they discovered across the battlefield was not a conflict site, but a slaughterhouse. Bodies lay in clusters, stripped of uniforms and weapons. Most had been scalped. The corpses displayed wounds from arrows, war clubs, and knives. The snow beneath them had melted and refrozen into sheets of red ice. Lieutenant George W. Drummond, leading a cavalry detachment that had joined Fetterman's command, was nowhere to be found, nor were his men. Among the few recognizable dead was Captain Frederick Brown, discovered atop the rock pile near Captain William J. Fetterman's body. Unlike the others, Brown had been killed by a bullet wound to the temple. Despite his baldness, his scalp had been removed. Ten Eyck dispatched a messenger to return to Fort Phil Kearny with a status report. The writer found Colonel Carrington still at his observation post. The messenger reported seeing thousands of warriors, but no sign of Captain Fetterman's command in formation. The men feared all had been killed, warriors everywhere but no soldiers standing. Carrington sent the messenger back to Ten Eyck with instructions to locate Fetterman and Drummond, establish contact with the wood train, and return all personnel to the fort without delay. Inside the fort, Carrington initiated defensive preparations. He ordered all civilians into the stockade and positioned every man capable of handling a rifle at the perimeter. Women loaded spare ammunition. The quartermaster distributed weapons to civilian contractors. The anticipated attack never materialized. The afternoon passed in tense silence. As daylight waned, the wagons from Ten Eyck's rescue party appeared at the fort's gates. Mules strained against their harnesses, skittish from the smell of blood that permeated their cargo. 50 bodies stacked in rows across the wagons. The report to Carrington was grim. 50 men recovered with approximately 30 still unaccounted for, including Lieutenant Drummond and his cavalry, who may have been separated from Fetterman's main force. Carrington established a defensive perimeter and planned to return for the remaining men, when conditions permitted. That night, as temperatures plummeted, the bodies of 50 soldiers froze solid in the fort's improvised morgue. Carrington drafted his official report documenting the greatest military disaster the United States had suffered in its Indian conflicts to date. December 21, 1866, he wrote, "This afternoon Captain Fetterman, with 80 men under his command, was ambushed and killed while in pursuit of Indians who attacked the wood train." He called for volunteers to carry this news to Fort Laramie, 236 miles away, through hostile territory and winter storms. Portuguese Phillips stepped forward, initiating the desperate Christmas ride that would soon alert the nation to Red Cloud's unprecedented victory. Inside Fort Phil Kearny, the surviving soldiers counted their remaining ammunition, approximately 8,000 rounds. If attacked, they would be drastically outnumbered with limited supplies to defend the fort against Red Cloud's warriors. With the grim reality of the massacre confirmed, Fort Phil Kearny faced a critical imperative alert military command of their dire situation. Colonel Carrington knew the fort's survival might depend on how quickly reinforcements could arrive. Standing before his remaining men in the crowded officers' quarters on the night of December 21, 1866, Carrington called for volunteers to carry dispatches to Fort Laramie. "I need men willing to risk the journey south," Carrington said, holding up sealed documents 236 miles through hostile territory in winter conditions. "The fate of everyone in this fort may depend on it." John Phillips stepped forward from the crowd. Known as Portuguese due to his Portuguese ancestry, Phillips was a civilian prospector who had come to the Wyoming Territory seeking fortune. Unlike the soldiers who surrounded him, he had no military obligation to accept such a dangerous mission. "I'll go, Colonel," Phillips said. His motivation ran deeper than mere duty. Phillips had been collecting water when the attack occurred. Had he been at his usual post, he would have accompanied his mining partner Isaac Fisher and restaurant owner James Wheatley with Lieutenant Drummond's cavalry. Now, Fisher and Wheatley were among the missing 30 men. Based on the condition of the bodies already recovered, Phillips harbored no illusions about their fate. Carrington nodded and called Phillips to his office. There, he drafted 2 urgent messages, one addressed to General Philip St. George Cooke in Omaha, the other to General Ulysses S. Grant in Washington. Both contained identical information. Disaster has struck Fort Phil Kearny, a detachment under Captain Fetterman, comprising 50 infantry and 30 cavalry, has been attacked and destroyed. The infantry dead have been recovered. The cavalry are missing and presumed dead. I will defend this post to the last man, but cannot mount offensive operations without reinforcements. Carrington recruited 2 additional messengers to accompany Phillips, Daniel Dixon and Raphael Gallagher. Their primary destination would be Horseshoe Station, 196 miles away, where the nearest telegraph stood. However, recognizing the telegraph lines often failed in winter, all 3 were instructed to continue to Fort Laramie regardless. Around midnight, the temperature dropped to +18 degrees Fahrenheit. Weather clouds gathered on the horizon, portending another storm. In the fort stables, Phillips prepared methodically. He selected the strongest available horse, a bay gelding known for its endurance. The animal would need to carry him through terrain where stopping might mean death. Phillips dressed in layers, wool undergarments, flannel shirt, buckskin trousers, and buffalo hide overcoat. He pulled knee-high fur-lined boots over wool socks and covered his head with a beaver fur cap. Sheepskin mittens protected his hands. In his saddlebags he packed minimal provisions, hardtack jerky, and a small flask of whiskey, not for comfort but as emergency medicine against the cold. Carrington accompanied Phillips to the fort's main gate. The first snowflakes began to fall as the heavy wooden doors swung open. "God be with you," Carrington said, extending his hand. Phillips nodded, spurred his horse, and vanished into the night. The initial hours of Phillips' journey passed in tense vigilance. He kept to the established trail, but remained alert for any sign of native scouts. The snowfall intensified, covering his tracks, but also reducing visibility to mere yards. By dawn, he had covered approximately 30 miles and sought shelter in a dense stand of pines where he could rest without being easily spotted. The pattern established itself over the next 3 days: ride by night, hide by day. Phillips conserved his provisions, eating small amounts of jerky and melting snow for water. The temperature never rose above zero, and he battled continuous snowstorms that would have halted less determined men. On the second night, Phillips encountered Dixon and Gallagher, who had departed by a different route. The men had been ravaged by the journey. Their faces showed signs of frostbite, their horses stumbled with exhaustion, and their supplies were nearly depleted. They shared what little food remained and continued southward together. On Christmas morning, after riding through a particularly brutal night where temperatures dropped to 25 degrees, the 3 messengers staggered into Horseshoe Station. Their arrival startled the telegraph operator, who had received no messages for days due to the weather. The men collapsed near the station stove, while the operator transcribed Carrington's messages to the telegram form. After several attempts to send the message, the operator turned to the exhausted men. "Lines are down," he reported. "Storm damage. I've been unable to get through to Laramie or points east for 24 hours. Phillips, despite his exhaustion, began redonning his protective layers. "What are you doing?" Dixon asked, his voice hoarse from cold. "Continuing to Laramie." Phillips replied, "That was our order." Dixon and Gallagher protested. They had nearly died reaching Horseshoe Station. Fort Laramie lay another 40 miles south through deep snow, and another storm was visible on the horizon. Moreover, their horses could barely stand, much less carry them further. Phillips would not be dissuaded. He tightened his gear, mounted his trembling horse, and rode south from the station. The blizzard subsided around noon, but the landscape had transformed into a blinding white expanse. Snow blindness set in as Phillips squinted against the glare reflecting off the pristine surface. With no visible landmarks, he relied on his horse's instinct and his knowledge of the general direction. By dusk, another storm front moved in, bringing renewed snow and plummeting temperatures. Phillips pressed forward, his body hunched over his horse's neck for warmth. The horse slowed to a walk each step, becoming more labored in the deepening drifts. Hours after nightfall, the horse's ears pricked forward. In the distance, faint lights punctured the darkness, the officers' quarters at Fort Laramie. The animal moved toward the lights, its breath forming thick clouds in the frigid air. A sentry stationed at the fort's perimeter noticed the approaching figure. Through the swirling snow, he made out a single horse moving slowly toward the gate, its rider slumped forward and motionless. The temperature stood at 25 degrees. The guard alerted the sergeant of the watch, who dispatched 2 men to intercept the rider. They reached Phillips just as he slid from the saddle, unable to walk or speak clearly. Phillips gestured weakly toward his saddlebag, where Carrington's dispatches remained, sealed and dry. "Commander," Phillips whispered through cracked lips. "Must see the commander." The soldiers half-carried Phillips to the officers' Christmas ball, taking place in the fort's main hall. Their entrance silenced the festivities. Women in evening gowns and officers in dress uniforms stared as Phillips was brought before Colonel Henry Palmer, Fort Laramie's commander. Palmer broke the seal on Carrington's dispatch and read it quickly. The color drained from his face as he grasped the magnitude of the disaster. Fetterman's entire command wiped out Fort Phil Kearny, vulnerable to attack. The massacre had occurred 4 days earlier, and only now was he learning of it. "Get this man medical attention," Palmer ordered. He then turned to his adjutant. "Send Carrington's message verbatim to General Cooke and General Grant immediately. And prepare a relief column." As Phillips was led away to recover his horse, collapsed and died in the fort's parade ground, having given everything to complete the mission. News of what would become known as the Fetterman Massacre spread rapidly through military channels and eventually to the American public. John Portuguese Phillips' extraordinary 236-mile winter ride had ensured the survival of Fort Phil Kearny and secured his place in frontier history. The deadly effectiveness of Red Cloud's forces and the unprecedented scale of American casualties forced the U.S. government to reconsider its entire strategy in the Powder River country. For the first time, a Native American leader had orchestrated a military victory that would ultimately lead to significant policy concessions from the United States. While Phillips' desperate ride to Fort Laramie secured reinforcements for the besieged Fort Phil Kearny Red Cloud, and his warriors celebrated their unprecedented victory. At their winter camp along the Tongue River, the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho allies held 3 days of mourning for warriors lost in what they called the Battle of the 100 in the Hand, a name derived from a holy man's prophecy about defeating many enemies at once. On the 4th day after the battle victory, celebrations commenced. Warriors performed honor dances that continued late into the night with special recognition given to those who had distinguished themselves in combat. Yellow Eagle received honors for leading the attack on the wood-cutting party that had drawn Fetterman out. American Horse and Young Man, afraid of his horses, were celebrated for their assault on Fetterman's infantry. Most significantly, a 25-year-old warrior named Crazy Horse received special recognition for his daring role in luring the soldiers into the prepared ambush. The battle marked a turning point for Crazy Horse. His tactical brilliance in drawing Fetterman over Lodge Trail Ridge had proven decisive. From this moment forward, he was no longer merely a respected fighter, but was being groomed for leadership within the Oglala Lakota. The highest honors went to Red Cloud himself. His strategic vision had made the victory possible, and his leadership had maintained an unprecedented alliance among typically independent bands. Through an interpreter present at the celebration, Red Cloud acknowledged the accolades but remained measured in his assessment. The attack was successful, he reportedly stated, but our work remains unfinished. The warriors had not killed all the soldiers, nor had they burned the forts to the ground. Red Cloud knew the Bluecoats would send more men. After consulting with other leaders, he announced that their people would move westward toward the Bighorn Mountains rather than eastward to the Black Hills. There they would rest and recover through winter before resuming hostilities in spring, when they would target both Fort Phil Kearny and Fort C.F. Smith. Red Cloud's strategic goal remained unchanged: force the military to abandon the Bozeman Trail and the contested Powder River country. Meanwhile, at Fort Phil Kearny, Colonel Carrington led 83 soldiers and civilians back to the battlefield on December 22nd. Captain James Powell remained behind to secure the fort. Before departing, Carrington issued a sealed order to Powell. If warriors attacked in overwhelming numbers, Powell was to move all women and children into the ammunition magazine. They were to resist as long as possible, but if defeat became inevitable, Powell was to detonate the magazine. No one is to be taken alive, the order stated. The expected dawn attack never materialized. When Carrington reached the battlefield, he surveyed the same devastating scene Ten Eyck had witnessed, but now frozen solid in the near-zero temperatures. The recovery detail located Lieutenant Grummond and those who had followed him toward the decoy village. Grummond had been decapitated in addition to the customary mutilations. James Wheatley and Isaac Fisher, Portuguese Phillips's mining partner, were found among a group of 4 or 5 soldiers. The snow around their position contained approximately 65 blood spots, evidence of warriors killed or wounded by their Henry repeating rifles. The small group had not survived, but they had extracted a heavy toll before falling. Carrington's men collected the remaining 30 bodies and transported them back to the fort. In total, 81 soldiers and civilians had perished in the engagement. The toll included Captain William J. Fetterman, Captain Frederick Brown, and Lieutenant George Grummond among the officers. The enlisted casualties numbered 49 infantry soldiers and 27 cavalry troopers. 3 civilians also died, Wheatley Fisher and a 3rd contractor, who had been with the woodcutting detail. On Christmas Day, Carrington sent a burial detail to the cemetery near Pilot Knob to prepare graves. A severe blizzard struck that night, making excavation impossible. The burial was eventually completed on December 26th, with the bodies placed in a long trench grave. The survivors at Fort Phil Kearny could do nothing but wait, unsure whether reinforcements or another warrior attack would arrive first. Morale plummeted as men faced the reality that they were isolated in hostile territory over 200 miles from substantial support. The first reinforcements reached Fort Phil Kearny on December 27th, when troops from Reno Station traversed the snow-covered landscape. Though inadequate for offensive operations, these additional men bolstered the fort's defenses and brought news that more help was coming. The terrified civilians continued to prepare for an attack that Red Cloud had no immediate intention of launching. His strategy called for patience during the harsh winter months when large-scale operations were impractical. The warriors had withdrawn to their winter camps, conserving strength and supplies for spring campaigns. News of the Fetterman Massacre spread rapidly through military channels. In Washington, General William Tecumseh Sherman advocated for harsh retribution. The Sioux must be exterminated or forced into reservations, he wrote in a memorandum to the War Department. However, immediate military response was impossible due to winter conditions and the reduction of military forces following the Civil War. The Army had only 25,000 soldiers, most stationed east of the Mississippi or occupying former Confederate states. Resources for a major Western campaign were simply unavailable. General Phillips St. George Cooke, commander of the Department of the Platte, shifted blame to Carrington. He dispatched orders that Carrington was formally relieved of command, despite evidence that Fetterman had disobeyed explicit instructions not to pursue warriors beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. In January 1867, Henry Carrington rode out of the fort he had constructed on the High Plains and began the long journey to Fort McPherson in Nebraska. Accompanying him and his family was Frances Grummond, Lieutenant Washington Grummond's pregnant widow, now 8 months into her term. Her husband's decapitated body lay in one of the wagons behind her. Frances Grummond later married Carrington after his first wife's death, and both would spend decades defending his actions at Fort Phil Kearny against military critics who used him as a scapegoat for the disaster. Colonel Henry Wessels replaced Carrington at Fort Phil Kearny, bringing much-needed supplies, including fresh horses and cattle. These livestock would soon become primary targets for Red Cloud's warriors, who recognized that depriving the forts of transportation and food was as effective as direct attacks. The military reaction to the Fetterman disaster revealed systemic problems. Letters between General Sherman and Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant discussed the need for a more coherent Indian policy, Sherman wrote on January 15, 1867. The recent massacre of Fetterman's party may require us to chastise the Sioux this next summer, and for this we must make preparations. But the country should understand that $50 million a year is consumed by the Army simply to watch and guard these Indian settlements against a few thousand savages. Sherman's letter reflected the financial reality facing military planners. The post-Civil War economy could not sustain expensive Indian campaigns, yet public outrage demanded action. This tension between military necessities and budget constraints would shape the coming months of the conflict. Inside Fort Phil Kearny, the winter passed in constant vigilance. Soldiers rotated through guard duties on shortened shifts due to the extreme cold. Women and children remained within the stockade, where temperatures inside buildings often fell below freezing, despite constant fire maintenance. The winter of 1866 to 1867 proved one of the harshest on record in the territory. Snow accumulated to depths of 5 feet on level ground, with drifts reaching 15 feet against the fort's walls. These conditions made military operations nearly impossible, but also prevented large-scale Native American attacks. Red Cloud used this period strategically. While his warriors preserved their strength, he strengthened political alliances among various bands. The victory over Fetterman had enhanced his prestige, drawing previously hesitant groups into his coalition. Crazy Horse, whose star had risen after the battle, spent the winter developing new tactics. He recognized that the soldiers' new breech-loading rifles would make future ambushes more costly. His solution involved quicker strikes against isolated targets rather than massed assaults. By February 1867, Fort Phil Kearny's situation had stabilized, but remained precarious. Regular supply trains from Fort Laramie brought ammunition and food, but required heavy escorts. Every woodcutting expedition, now limited to areas within sight of the fort's walls, included at least 40 armed guards. Colonel Wessels implemented changes to prevent another disaster. No officer could lead troops beyond Lodge Trail Ridge without written orders. Signal systems were enhanced with flag communications established between the fort and woodcutting parties. All soldiers received additional firearms, training, and ammunition allotments increased. As March approached and temperatures gradually rose, both sides prepared to resume the conflict. Red Cloud's warriors began filtering back toward their spring hunting grounds near the contested trail. At Fort Phil Kearny, Wessels received intelligence reports of increased warrior activity and restricted operations accordingly. The stage was set for spring hostilities that would determine the fate of American presence along the Bozeman Trail. Red Cloud's winter strategy of patience had preserved his alliance and fighting strength, while the U.S. military struggled with logistics, personnel shortages, and political pressures in the wake of the Fetterman disaster. As winter ice melted along the Tongue River in spring 1867, Red Cloud fulfilled his promise to resume hostilities. His warriors returned to the contested territory surrounding the Bozeman Trail forts and immediately implemented a campaign of persistent harassment. They struck at isolated targets, avoiding direct confrontation with the main garrisons, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of asymmetric warfare. June brought intensified small-scale engagements. Parties of 20 to 30 warriors targeted wood-cutting details and livestock herds. Cattle disappeared overnight from their corrals, sometimes without a single shot fired. By month's end, Fort Phil Kearny had lost 40 head of cattle, severely limiting the garrison's meat supplies and transportation capabilities. Colonel Henry Wessels, who had replaced Carrington as commander at Fort Phil Kearny, began to appreciate his predecessor's predicament. The relentless pressure forced him to assign entire companies to protect routine operations. A simple wood-gathering expedition now required 60 to 80 soldiers as escorts, straining the fort's defensive capabilities. With approximately 350 effectives at his disposal, Wessels could not maintain both adequate fort defense and secure necessary resources. By July, the attacks escalated in frequency and scale. Warriors disabled telegraph lines between the forts, further isolating the garrisons. Supply wagons required heavier escorts, consuming precious ammunition with each journey, Wessels reported to Department headquarters that he needed at least 200 additional troops to maintain basic operations. In late July, Red Cloud determined the time was right for another major offensive. He convened a war council with Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho allies to outline a coordinated strategy. The plan called for simultaneous attacks against both Fort C.F. Smith to the north and Fort Phil Kearny to the south, dividing military response capabilities. On the morning of August 1, 1867, Northern Cheyenne warriors, led by Dull Knife and Two Moons, struck a hay-cutting detail 2 miles from Fort C.F. Smith. The initial assault killed 2 cavalry troopers and 1 civilian contractor. The remaining 19 Americans formed a hasty defensive position using their hay wagons and mounds of cut grass. From this improvised fortification, they withstood repeated charges throughout the day. The hay cutters had been equipped with new Springfield Allen single-shot breech-loading rifles, which allowed them to maintain a rate of fire that surprised the attacking warriors. A relief column from Fort C.F. Smith arrived at dusk, prompting the Cheyenne to withdraw into the surrounding hills after sustaining significant casualties. The following morning, August 2nd, Red Cloud personally led approximately 1,000 warriors toward Fort Phil Kearny. The timing of his attack capitalized on a vulnerable situation. 2 wagon trains were scheduled to pass each other about 3 miles from the fort. One train filled with cut timber was returning from Piney Island logging camp. The other, consisting of empty wagons, was departing the fort for the same location. Among the riders leaving the fort that morning was John Portuguese Phillips, who had survived his remarkable journey to Fort Laramie and returned to the region. The wagon escort included 2 veteran officers from Carrington's command. Captain James Powell and Captain Ten Eyck. At approximately 9:00 in the morning, as the two wagon trains neared their passing point, a soldier spotted warriors observing them from a nearby hilltop. The observers were Red Cloud and another war leader conducting final reconnaissance before the attack. Within minutes, hundreds of mounted warriors descended from the surrounding hills, their war cries carrying across the plain. The warriors first struck the slower, timber-laden wagons, returning from Piney Island. The teamsters abandoned their vehicles as warriors set fire to the wagons. Captain Powell, commanding the second train, immediately ordered his 32 soldiers to form the 14 empty wagons into a defensive corral. This formation, later known as the wagon box fight, created a rough oval approximately 60 feet long and 30 feet wide. Powell's men removed the wagon boxes from their chassis and placed them on the ground, providing improved cover. They positioned themselves with about 5 feet between defenders' rifles resting on the 2-foot-high wooden boxes. Powell distributed ammunition and instructed his men to hold fire until warriors came within effective range. Red Cloud's forces attacked the wagon box corral with confidence born from their December victory. They expected to overwhelm the small force after the initial volley, assuming the soldiers still carried muzzle-loading rifles from the Civil War era that required 30 seconds to reload. The warriors prepared to accept casualties from the first volley, then close to hand-to-hand combat, where their superior numbers would prevail. Instead, they encountered devastating sustained fire. Unknown to Red Cloud, the U.S. Army had recently equipped frontier units with new Springfield Allen breech-loading rifles. These weapons could be reloaded in 5 seconds while lying prone, allowing soldiers to maintain continuous fire. Each man had 100 rounds of ammunition stored in pouches beside him. For more than 5 hours, Red Cloud's warriors mounted charge after charge against the wagon box corral. Each assault was repulsed with heavy casualties. Powell's men maintained disciplined fire, targeting mounted leaders and warriors who advanced too close. By early afternoon, the grassy plain surrounding the wagon boxes was littered with fallen warriors and horses. A relief column from Fort Phil Kearny, alerted by the sound of gunfire, arrived in the early afternoon. Red Cloud, recognizing the changing tactical situation and the unexpectedly high cost of the assault, ordered his forces to withdraw. The engagement resulted in 3 American soldiers killed and 2 wounded. Warrior casualties remain disputed in historical accounts, with military reports claiming between 60 and 120 killed or wounded. Native oral histories acknowledge significant losses, but dispute these higher figures. When Red Cloud and his war council assessed the day's outcome that evening, they initially viewed it as a defeat. They had failed to overrun either the hay-cutting party at Fort C.F. Smith or the wagon train near Fort Phil Kearny. Both forts remained intact, their garrisons bloodied but functional. Yet what appeared as a tactical setback would ultimately contribute to strategic victory. The constant pressure and harassment had profound psychological effects on military planners. Though the warriors had not captured the forts, they had demonstrated that normal operations were impossible without committing unsustainable military resources. General Ulysses S. Grant received reports from both engagements that emphasized the number of troops required to maintain the Bozeman Trail forts. Each fort needed at least 500 soldiers to operate safely, plus additional forces to escort supply trains. The estimated annual cost to maintain the 3 forts exceeded $1.2 million in expense, difficult to justify for protecting a trail that served relatively few travelers. Red Cloud's warfare of attrition had succeeded in making the Bozeman Trail economically and militarily untenable. Though he could not know it immediately after the August fights, his persistent campaign had already convinced key military and political leaders to reconsider the American presence in the Powder River country. The psychological victory would prove more decisive than any battlefield triumph. By September 1867, peace commissioners were preparing to negotiate with Plains tribes. Red Cloud's relentless pressure had achieved what direct assault could not, forcing the U.S. government to reconsider its territorial ambitions in the heart of Lakota hunting grounds. The final act of his successful campaign was about to begin When reports of the August attacks reached Eastern politicians, they faced an unprecedented situation. Red Cloud had maintained a multi-tribal alliance through 2 consecutive fighting seasons, a feat no Native American leader had previously accomplished. His coalition showed no signs of weakening or disbanding. A senior military commander informed Washington that subduing Red Cloud would require 20,000 troops, 1/3 of the entire United States Army. In the post-Civil War economy with Reconstruction demanding resources and attention, the government could not commit such forces to a Western conflict. The financial reality demanded diplomacy over continued warfare. In October 1867, initial peace negotiations began when representatives from both sides met at Fort Phil Kearny. Red Cloud proved himself a diplomatic strategist equal to his military prowess. He refused to attend personally, sending representatives instead with a simple, uncompromising message: peace would only come. When the Bozeman Trail closed permanently and Reno Station, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith were abandoned, the peace process stalled throughout winter 1867 and early spring 1868. Government negotiators attempted to preserve access to the trail while offering concessions on other issues. Red Cloud's envoys repeated his position without variation: close the trail, abandon the forts, depart Lakota territory. In April 1868, treaty talks resumed at Fort Laramie again. Red Cloud declined to attend, sending representatives with the same ultimatum. This time, his unwavering position produced historic results 1 month later. In May 1868, Major General Christopher Augur communicated the government's response: the Bozeman Trail would close to travelers, and all 3 forts would be abandoned. Red Cloud had achieved what no Native American leader before him had accomplished, forcing the United States to sign a peace treaty entirely on his terms. The government had conceded to all his demands. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 recognized Lakota sovereignty over the western half of present-day South Dakota, including the sacred Black Hills, plus hunting rights in the Powder River country of Wyoming and Montana. However, Red Cloud approached the agreement with hard-earned skepticism. He had witnessed previous treaties violated soon after signing. He demanded visible proof before putting his mark on any document. That summer proof arrived. American soldiers began removing equipment from Fort C.F. Smith, the northernmost outpost on the plains. Materials were sold to a Montana transport company rather than hauled away, indicating permanent abandonment. At Fort Phil Kearny, Colonel Wessels and his men dismantled everything portable as they prepared for departure. Soldiers tore down structures they had built with their own hands. 2 years earlier, similar activities occurred at Reno Station. In late August 1868, wagon trains rolled southeast toward Fort Laramie. Soldiers packed American flags from the forts and joined the caravans moving off the high plains. Their 2-year campaign in the Powder River country ended in complete withdrawal. At dawn the morning after the evacuation, Red Cloud and his warriors triumphantly burned all 3 abandoned forts to the ground. He had finally achieved his objective. Red Cloud then played his final card. Though minor in the broader picture, it surely gave him satisfaction. He made the United States government wait. The Army abandoned the forts in late August, just as the fall buffalo hunting season began. Red Cloud insisted that the Lakota complete their hunt before he would sign any treaty. For 2 anxious months, government officials waited for Red Cloud to formalize the agreement. On November 6, 1868, he rode into Fort Laramie as a victorious leader. The United States had closed the Bozeman Trail and abandoned 3 forts. They had ceded the most valuable western Lakota lands back to Red Cloud, the Powder River hunting grounds and the Black Hills. Red Cloud secured territory encompassed southeastern Montana, northeastern Wyoming, and the western half of South Dakota. At 47 years old, this marked the pinnacle of his life's achievement. Predictably, the victory proved temporary. Sitting Bull remained militantly independent, sending a message that he would not recognize Red Cloud's treaty or any agreement with the United States. He would continue fighting. Soon warriors, including Crazy Horse and American Horse, joined his camp. Even as the ink dried on the treaty, generals William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan began plotting ways to undermine the agreement without technical violations. Like most treaties with Native Americans, this one contained complex phrasing and ambiguous clauses open to interpretation. Sherman and Sheridan began maneuvering to restrict where the Lakota could live within their own territory. Red Cloud demonstrated his power by riding through Fort Laramie with 1,000 warriors, but stopped short of threatening renewed warfare. Instead, he and fellow Chief Spotted Tail took their grievances to the highest level, visiting Washington, D.C. in 1870. The journey proved eye-opening for both war leaders. They witnessed the full industrial and military might of the United States. During their capital tour, American politicians ensured they saw Army and Navy headquarters and especially the massive arsenals. President Ulysses S. Grant hosted a formal reception for Red Cloud at the White House. The war chief had become famous, the talk of the city. His entourage later traveled to New York City, where his celebrity grew further. Red Cloud undoubtedly enjoyed the admiration, but also recognized how small his victory had been in comparison to American power. If the United States concentrated its full might against the Lakota, his warriors could not prevail. Ultimately, the United States didn't need military force. Technological advancement accomplished what armies couldn't. Just 7 months after Red Cloud signed a treaty closing the Bozeman Trail, the trail became obsolete. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed south of the trail on May 10, 1869. Travelers could now cross the continent aboard the Great Iron Horse in a fraction of the time required by the old wagon trails. The Bozeman Trail's strategic importance evaporated overnight. Fighting on the high plains continued for several more years, but for the Lakota, the beginning of the end had arrived. In 1872, Red Cloud moved to the first reservation on the plains called Red Cloud Agency, located in northwestern Nebraska, not far from his birthplace. 1 year later, the financial panic of 1873 gripped the nation and the government desperately sought gold. The search for gold ore had never diminished at the individual level, with miners ignoring treaties and tribal boundaries throughout the country. Now gold became more precious than normal. In 1874, gold was discovered in the gulches of the Black Hills. White prospectors flooded into the most sacred Lakota land, disregarding treaty protections and tribal traditions. The Army made nominal efforts to expel trespassers, but ultimately gold prevailed, as it typically did in American history. Soon after, one of the most notorious boomtowns in American history grew in a gulch named for fallen timber on its hillside deadwood. As this raucous town formed, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse fought the final major battle on the high plains. They annihilated the command of a flamboyant general named George Armstrong Custer, who suffered a fate similar to Captain Fetterman in virtually the same region. 2 years later, in 1878, Red Cloud Agency relocated to South Dakota and was renamed Pine Ridge Reservation. Red Cloud and his wife Pretty Owl moved with it. The couple had 9 children. Red Cloud's descendants followed a different path than he had. They adopted white ways, living in houses, wearing shirts and trousers, and attending schools. Red Cloud's eldest son, Jack. Red Cloud became an Oglala leader. Jack's son, James, also became a leader, as did James's son, Oliver Red Cloud, who died only recently on July 4, 2013. While Red Cloud advocated for better treatment of his people during his later years, Colonel Henry Carrington spent the remainder of his life defending his actions at Fort Phil Kearny. He received valuable assistance from his wife Margaret, who published a book about their time on the plains that blamed Fetterman for the massacre. Margaret died of tuberculosis in 1870, just 3 years after leaving the outpost. Carrington eventually married Frances Grummond, Lieutenant Washington Grummond's widow. Frances embraced her new husband's cause and wrote her own book about her fort experiences. Her memoir, published in 1910, supported Carrington's version of events during that fateful winter of 1866. Carrington spoke about the incident frequently to anyone who would listen until his death on October 26, 1912, at age 88. Red Cloud also lived to 88 years. He died on December 10, 1909. After returning from his eastern trip in 1870, He vowed never to fight again, and never did. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse extended invitations over the years, but Red Cloud declined them. He outlived Crazy Horse by more than 30 years and Sitting Bull by nearly 20. He was the last great Lakota war leader. Red Cloud once said, "They made us many promises, more than I can remember, but they kept only one. They promised to take our land, and they took it." 6 years before his death, he gave his final public speech to his people. He was direct and to the point, as always, but also poetic. "The sun has set, my day is done. Darkness is stealing over me before I lie down to rise no more. I will speak to my people. Hear me, my friends, for it is not the time to lie. The Great Spirit made us the Indians and gave us this land we live in. He gave us the buffalo, the antelope, and the deer for food and clothing. We moved our hunting grounds from the Minnesota to the Platte and from the Mississippi to the Great Mountains. No one put bounds on us. We were free as the winds and eagle, not subject to the commands of any man." In the decades following Red Cloud's victory, the United States systematically violated every meaningful provision of the Fort Laramie Treaty. The government seized the Black Hills after gold was discovered. They restricted Lakota movement, banned religious practices, and forced children into government boarding schools designed to eliminate Native culture. By the time of Red Cloud's death, the once powerful Lakota nation lived in poverty on diminished reservations. Yet Red Cloud's achievement remains singular in American history. He drove the United States military from the field and forced the government to negotiate peace on his terms. His strategic combination of military pressure, alliance building, and diplomatic maneuvering produced the only clear Native American victory in the centuries-long struggle for the continent. The Oglala leader demonstrated that even against overwhelming odds, skillful leadership and unwavering determination could change the course of history, if only temporarily. Red Cloud's War represents the only successful Native American military campaign against the United States. His victory proved fleeting, undermined by gold railroads and broken promises. Yet for one brief moment in 1868, this Lakota leader forced a powerful nation to retreat and concede. His strategic brilliance and political savvy achieved what others deemed impossible, securing his place in American history.